I'd like to share with you the top 10 problems with failure questions in job interviews. The first scenario is if candidates hearing this question for the first time will likely block. Right? So during the heat of the moment, a little bit of added pressure. It's a pretty negative question, so it's not uncommon for candidates to get stuck. However, if you prepare this in advance, then this will show during job interviews. The second scenario of when asking candidates, tell me about the time when you failed, is candidates who say something online, then I have had no major failures in my career. Right? And this may happen with someone who has a career spanning over the past 20 years. What does this reveal about a candidate if they say, I have had no failures in my career? It simply means that they might have had a very comfortable job throughout the years, which never required them to get outside of their comfort zone, and therefore, their overall perception is that they never fail. Okay, this in contrast with people working in high-performing environments where failure is normal. Right? The third mistake I'd like to share with you with respect to failure questions in job interviews is people refusing to provide an actual failure. They provide something insignificant, something along the lines, you know what, early in my career I made a very small mistake which had basically no impact. Okay, I believe there's better ways to capitalize from these failure questions, especially if you prepare them a little bit in advance, and I'm going to share with you tips as we continue with this advice. Okay, the fourth scenario mistake of when answering failure questions would be some candidates refuse to take ownership of those failures and basically talk about someone else's failure or at least a group failure for which they weren't entirely responsible. Right? So as I said, this signals a certain lack of ownership. So that will, not play to your advantage either. So most of the time, this is a problem of formulation. You formulate it in such a way that you do not take ownership of it in full. Right? If you do it for a director, an executive type of role, that's somewhat acceptable. But if you do it for a technical PM, that will no longer fly. Okay. The fifth mistake I encountered when asking people about their failures for the purpose of a job interview would be candidates who give me not one but 3 failures when asked this question. And one may rightfully ask, but then who on earth would give you 3 failures if you only ask them for 1? I mean, why would that be the case? And one scenario is what I call the open up technique. Basically, you make the candidate feel comfortable. You ask them easy questions. What makes you smile? What's your best story and this? And then you subtly ask them, hey, you know what? Have you had any major shortcomings as of recently? Oh yes, 3 of them, And basically, once you open up the candidate, they might spill the beans, so to speak. So 1 failure story is enough. You don't need to share 3. The 6th scenario I wanted to share with you here would be a failure that is a disqualifier during a job interview. For example, I got laid off from my previous role 1 week ago because I made a monumental mistake. These sort of failures cannot sell you in any good way for the purpose of a job interview, and I'm going to talk about how can you sell yourself on your failure stories as well, right? But don't talk about failures that will disqualify you from the job, right? The 7th mistake I wanted to share with you here would be a failure that you cannot get over with. Okay, an event you cannot get peacefully over with. Maybe you had a conflict with your previous manager and they pushed you out of the business. Maybe because it's too recent, it still haunts you. It's not the best idea to talk about these things in job interviews. If they're still fresh in your memory, if you cannot get over that event, if it doesn't sell you in any positive way, then it's maybe time to brainstorm for another failure story, right? What would be a good example of a great failure story? Let me continue with the mistake number 8 when answering failure questions would be candidates answering using a strict STAR format. They would present the situation and the challenge, then they would talk about the action, and then the result is we failed to achieve this on time, and then they stop. Okay, because if you filled in your STAR answer, what else is it needed? To answer this, well, how do you sell yourself in job interviews on the failure stories? You do it with the learnings. Okay, my advice would be here to replace the results in your STAR answer with the learnings. And I would even advise you to have 50% of your STAR answer talking about your learnings. But you might as well, talk about the STAR format and then use it in STAR and then add the learnings, on the condition that the learnings should be 50% of your answer, because this is how you sell yourself with these stories, right? So if you use the STAR format, ensure that the learnings and how you grew from that experience is the main story. That is the main reason why the interviewer will remember you after that job interview, right? The 9th mistake number 9 I wanted to share with you, which happens a lot in my experience with the people I work with, is candidates who have some failures which they feel like they're not great stories, so they would invent a few metrics, or they would invent, some decisions which maybe weren't actually the case, simply because the AI recommended you do so, or maybe because you wanted to simply make it more impactful because you feel it makes no sense. My advice to you would be to not to invent metrics. I believe that's the wrong path. That's a bad way to cheat in job interviews. But what I would recommend you is to give it a go. If you're happy with it, try making it look better and better and better, and give yourself 1 hour or 2 hours to make that story great. If you cannot make it great, then simply ditch it and find another one. Okay, it's very common for me to brainstorm with candidates 3 times to find a proper failure story. Okay, so it's nothing wrong if you change your mind about what's the best failure story for you to share during a job interview. But don't invent metrics, because that rarely flies. It doesn't play to your advantage when it comes to communicating a genuine story for the purpose of a job interview. And mistake number 10 I wanted to share with you with these failure questions is answering them vaguely or hypothetically. Okay, so the situation is the following. The interviewer might not ask you, tell me about the time when you failed, but they might, spin a little bit the question, something along lines, how would you deal with failures in your future role? Okay, and what happens here is that most candidates would like to get philosophical, their philosophy of failure. Now, if you're applying for a role where the philosophy of failure is central to your subject matter expertise, no problem with that. But in my experience, that's unlikely to be the case. What's likely to be the case is that they would reframe the question in a slightly counterintuitive way, because people prepare the most commonly asked questions, right? And to still think at answering these questions behaviorally, right? What the definition of behavioral interview is when they look at your past experiences as a predictor of your future success on the job, right? So even if the question is hypothetical and forward-looking by nature, if you manage to pitch, after a brief introduction with some stories from which you grew significantly in your career, that would still greatly benefit you when compared to sharing your philosophy of failure and speaking hypothetically, so to speak, in this job interviews. So these were my top 10 mistakes. I hope you found them useful, and thank you very much for watching.